rabbit can turn a handful of grass into a pound of meat faster than almost any animal on a farm. She carries a litter for about 31 days. She can have 6 to 12 babies at once. She can be pregnant again within days of giving birth. 12 weeks later, those babies are ready. No cow does that. No pig comes close. So here is the question. If rabbit meat is this efficient, why is it not in the freezer aisle next to chicken? Why does the idea feel strange to almost everyone in the English-speaking world? Because the real answer has nothing to do with farming. It is a virus, a cartoon rabbit, and a factory built around a different animal. And there is one more thing. For about 5 years, tens of millions of people ate rabbit every single week. Then they stopped, almost overnight. Nobody ordered them to. Here is the part that makes no sense. In 1943, rabbit farming was patriotic. Your government printed pamphlets telling you to do it. By 1970, the same meat was almost unbuyable. Nothing about the animal changed. The biology stayed identical. The nutrition stayed identical. The price stayed cheap. Something else changed instead, and it changed inside people's heads. I will show you exactly what it was, but not yet, because there is a piece of this that has to come first. Most people assume rabbit disappeared because it tasted bad, or because it was too expensive, or because it was somehow unhealthy. All three of those are wrong. In fact, rabbit meat nutrition beats chicken on paper, and that is where it gets uncomfortable. Because the healthiest meat in the room also carries a warning that almost nobody knows about. You can starve to death eating rabbit, not because there is not enough of it, because there is too little fat in it. Rabbit is roughly 21 grams of protein per 100 grams, with very little fat. That sounds perfect. It is not. Explorers and trappers in North America ran into this the hard way. They lived on lean game through winter and got sick anyway. Nausea, weakness, wasting. They called it rabbit starvation. Doctors now call it protein poisoning. Your liver can only process so much protein without fat or carbohydrate alongside it. Eat nothing but lean rabbit, and your body runs out of usable energy while your stomach is full. So the leanest meat on earth is also the one you cannot live on alone. Hold that thought. It matters later, and not for the reason you think. Because in 1943, that warning did not matter at all. Rabbit was never meant to be the whole meal. It was the meal you could make when there was nothing else. Picture a woman in Manchester in the middle of the war. Beef is rationed. Pork is rationed. Her husband is somewhere in North Africa, and in the yard, in a wooden hutch, there are 8 rabbits eating potato peel and grass clippings. That hutch fed her children. Millions of hutches like it fed a country. Wartime rabbit farming was not a novelty. It was survival, and it worked. If that surprises you, subscribe now, because the next part is the piece that got erased from the story. It explains almost every food rule you have never questioned. Let us go back to the numbers, because they are genuinely absurd. A cow is pregnant for about 9 months. She gives you 1 calf. That calf then needs another 1.5 years of feed, water, and land before it is worth slaughtering. Start to finish, you are 2.5 years in for one animal. A rabbit is pregnant for about a month. She gives you a litter, not a single. She can be bred again while she is still nursing. Her young reach slaughter weight in around 12 weeks. Do that math across a year, and one doe with her offspring can outproduce a cow by a wide margin in usable meat. That is the whole reason people keep calling it the most efficient meat nobody eats. On paper, it is not close. Now add the resources. A beef animal needs pasture, acres of it, or the grain equivalent trucked in. It needs enormous amounts of water across its whole life. A rabbit needs a hutch, a bucket, and scraps. You can raise rabbit meat in a back garden in a city, which is exactly what people did. The feed conversion ratio matters here. That is the number of kilos of feed needed to make 1 kilo of meat. Cattle are poor at it. Sheep are worse. Rabbits are good, and they can eat forage humans cannot. So if you were designing a protein system from scratch for a crowded planet, rabbit would be near the top of the list. Which raises an obvious problem with everything I just said, because chicken beats it. This is the myth I have to break, because you will see it repeated everywhere. People love to say rabbit is more efficient than chicken. In 1940, that was defensible. Today, it is not. The modern broiler chicken has been bred so aggressively that it reaches market weight in about 6 weeks on remarkably little feed. In a straight rabbit versus chicken comparison, on feed alone, chicken now wins. But hold on, because that fact does not save the argument. It creates a bigger one. Chicken did not start out that way. In 1940, chickens were slow, scrawny, and mostly kept for eggs. Chicken became efficient because billions of dollars and 80 years of breeding were poured into it. Rabbit never got that. So the real question is not which animal is better, it is which animal got chosen. A quick word on what it actually tastes like, because this trips people up. Rabbit is pale, mild, and firm. Most people who try it say it is somewhere between chicken thigh and pork loin. It is not gamey the way venison is. Farmed rabbit especially is very neutral. And that turns out to be a marketing disaster. If the selling point of rabbit meat is that it tastes a bit like chicken, you have just told the customer to buy chicken. Chicken is cheaper, easier to cook, and already in the trolley. Every failed attempt to revive rabbit has run into this exact wall. There is no flavor argument strong enough to overcome an emotional objection. You cannot sell a mild substitute to someone who is squeamish about the original. And to understand the choosing, you have to go back further than the war. Rabbits are not native to Britain. The Normans brought them over after 1066 and kept them in managed warrens. For centuries, they were a luxury. Warreners were employed to protect them. Poaching one could ruin you. Then the rabbits did what rabbits do. They got out. They bred. They spread across the countryside until the animal that started as a lord's delicacy became something anyone with a snare could catch. And that flipped its meaning completely. By the 19th century, wild rabbit was poor people's food in Britain. Cheap, common, associated with hard times. That reputation never fully washed off. Keep it in mind because it is one of the quiet reasons rabbit farming never got respectable again. By the Victorian era, rabbit was everywhere in working-class Britain. Street sellers, pie shops, Sunday stew. In America, it was similar but more regional. Wild rabbit was hunted across the South and the Midwest and eaten without a second thought. Then came the Great Depression, and rabbit did what it always does in a crisis. It scaled up. Families who could not afford beef built hutches. Some sold pelts alongside the meat. In parts of the United States, it earned a nickname, Hoover Hog, a bitter joke about the president and what people were actually eating. So the pattern is already visible before the war even starts. Raising rabbits for meat was not exotic. It was the thing you did when money ran out, which quietly meant it was the thing you stopped doing the second money came back. Then the war arrives, and the government does something remarkable. It tells people to farm rabbits on purpose. In the United States, the Department of Agriculture published guidance on domestic rabbit raising. Extension offices handed out plans for hutches. Nutritionists wrote up rabbit as a lean, high-protein alternative when beef was rationed. This was not fringe advice. It was official policy. And here is the detail that matters most. In Britain, rabbit was not rationed the same way beef and pork were. That single administrative fact reshaped an entire country's diet in about 2 years. When one meat is limited by coupon and another is not, people do not need convincing. They just eat the one they can get. So Britain built an entire amateur industry around it. Clubs formed in towns across the country. Members shared breeding stock, feed advice, and hutch designs. Local groups were encouraged to collect kitchen scraps to feed the animals, which closed the loop neatly. Waste in, protein out. Schools kept rabbits. Allotments kept rabbits. Back gardens that had never held livestock suddenly held livestock. For a few years, backyard rabbit farming was as normal as growing potatoes. Nobody found it strange. Nobody apologized for it at dinner. And the meat itself was good. Slow-cooked in cider, stewed with onions, made into pies. It behaved a lot like chicken and took sauce beautifully. This is the peak. Tens of millions of people, 2 countries, one perfectly ordinary meat. Now watch how fast it falls apart. The war ends, rationing eventually ends, and rabbit does not just decline, it collapses. Within roughly 2 decades, it goes from a staple to a curiosity. A generation of British and American children grew up having never eaten it, and more importantly, never seeing it eaten. Meanwhile, chicken, the animal that was scrawny and slow in 1940, becomes the most popular meat in both countries. Now, part of that is simple. When people can afford beef again, they buy beef. Wartime food carries a stigma. Nobody wants to keep eating like it is still 1943. But that alone does not explain a collapse this total. Plenty of wartime foods survived. Rabbit did not just fade, it got pushed. And in 1953, something arrived in Britain that pushed very hard. The American version was quieter but real. Youth farming programs taught rabbit husbandry alongside poultry and goats. Extension bulletins covered breeds, hutch construction, feeding, and slaughter. Commercial rabbitries grew in California and the Midwest, supplying restaurants and city markets. Pelts went to the fur trade, so a single animal had 2 revenue lines. For a moment, there was a genuine attempt to make rabbit meat production a normal American farm business, not a stopgap. And it half worked. Production climbed through the war years. Trade associations formed. Then, demand evaporated faster than anyone had planned for, and the infrastructure that had just been built had nothing to feed. That is a specific kind of industry death, not a slow decline, a sudden vacuum. A virus called myxomatosis. It comes from South American rabbits, which mostly tolerate it. European rabbits do not. In them, it is catastrophic. Australia released it deliberately in 1950 to control a wild rabbit plague that was destroying farmland. It worked, brutally. Australian rabbit numbers crashed. Then it reached Europe. In 1952, a French doctor released the virus on his own estate to protect his crops. He intended it to stay on his land. It did not. Within a couple of years, it had spread across France and jumped the Channel. It reached Britain in 1953. And this is the moment the story of rabbit meat in the English-speaking world quietly ends, though almost nobody realized it at the time. Here is why this virus mattered so much more than a normal outbreak. Most livestock disease is invisible to the public. Animals get sick indoors, behind fences, and the public sees a headline at most. Myxomatosis was the opposite. It happened in fields, in hedgerows, on roadsides, in front of everyone. And it is a horrible way to die. Swelling around the head and eyes, blindness, days of it. Rabbits that could not see stumbled into open ground where anyone walking a dog could find them. So an entire country watched at close range over months. The wild rabbit population in Britain was reduced by an estimated 99% within a few years. That is not a decline, that is an erasure, and it happened in public view. And the reaction was not what the planners expected. Officially, this was pest control. Wild rabbits caused serious crop damage, and plenty of farmers welcomed it. But large parts of the public were horrified. Animal welfare campaigners condemned it as needless cruelty. Newspapers carried the images. Parliament debated it, and deliberately spreading the disease was made an offense. Think about what that does to a food. For 15 years, rabbit meant dinner. Then, for 3 years, rabbit meant a blind animal dying by the side of a road. That association does not stay in one compartment. It attaches to the animal itself. And once an image like that lands, the meat on the plate is not the same meat anymore. But here is the problem with blaming the virus, and it is a big one. Myxomatosis faded. Rabbit populations recovered over decades. Farmed rabbits were never the main victims anyway, because they lived in hutches, away from the insects that spread it. If disease were the whole explanation, rabbit meat should have come back within a generation. It did not. It stayed gone. So the virus is not the cause. It is the trigger. Something else was already growing in the background at exactly the same time, and it was growing in the same back gardens where the hutches used to be. It arrived quietly, it looked completely harmless, and it did more damage to rabbit farming than any virus ever could. Prosperity. That is the thing nobody puts in the story, and it is the one that did the real work. After the war, incomes rose, housing improved, families had spare money and spare space for the first time in a decade. And one of the first things people spend spare money on is comfort for their children. Rabbits are small, quiet, cheap to feed, and they live happily in exactly the same hutch you already had in the garden. So the hutch stayed. The purpose changed. The animal in it stopped being livestock and became a pet with a name. This is the switch. Pet versus livestock is not a fact about an animal. It is a decision a culture makes. And Britain and America made theirs in about 15 years. And once an animal has a name, it is finished as food. That is not sentiment, it is well documented. Naming an animal makes people rate it as more intelligent, more capable of suffering, and less acceptable to eat. Farmers have known this forever, which is why the ones raising meat animals often refuse to let children name them. So picture the timeline overlapping. In the same decade, in the same country, in the same back garden, rabbit is being removed from the dinner table and installed in the child's bedroom. Rabbit meat production was competing with a rival it could never beat. Not chicken, affection. And then popular culture arrived to make the switch permanent, and it did it with characters most of you already know by name. Peter Rabbit was published in 1902, mischievous, clothed, in danger from a farmer who wants to put him in a pie. That is the first thing millions of children ever learn about rabbits. And note the framing. Eating him is the villain's plan. Bugs Bunny arrives in 1940, and he is not a prey animal at all. He is smarter than the hunter, faster than the hunter, and he wins every single time. Thumper hops through Bambi in 1942. Soft, funny, harmless. Now line those dates up against wartime rabbit farming. The exact generation being told to raise rabbits for meat was the first generation raised on rabbits as heroes. Those two ideas cannot share a plate forever. One of them had to lose, and the one with the songs and the merchandise won. Then, in 1972, a novel arrived that finished the job. Watership Down gave rabbits politics, religion, language, and grief. The film in 1978 traumatized an entire generation of British children, and it is still famous for it. That is the endpoint of a 70-year drift. Rabbits went from livestock to characters to protagonists with inner lives. Meanwhile, pigs, which are at least as intelligent as dogs, kept being farmed at enormous scale because nobody built a childhood around them in the same way. So the line between food and not food was never drawn by biology. It was drawn by exposure, by which animals a culture met first as friends. Psychologists have studied exactly this, and they gave the discomfort a name. It is called the meat paradox. Most people say they care about animal welfare. Most of those same people eat animals. Those two positions create real psychological friction, and the mind resolves it in predictable ways. One way is categorization. You sort animals into food and not food. And once an animal is filed under not food, the question stops being asked. Another way is dissociation. You separate the meat from the animal it came from. Language does a lot of this work. We say beef, not cow, pork, not pig. Notice there is no separate word for rabbit. You order rabbit. The animal's name is right there on the menu, which makes the whole thing much harder to look at while you eat it. And here is the counterintuitive part. The more familiar an animal is, the less likely people are to eat it. That is backwards from how we think familiarity works. Familiar food should be comfortable, but familiar animal means known individual, and a known individual is not a portion. Cows are farmed everywhere, and almost nobody has met one personally. Rabbits are farmed almost nowhere in Britain and America, and nearly everyone has met one personally, in a classroom or a friend's garden. So the food taboo around rabbit is not irrational. It is doing exactly what taboos are built to do. It protects the category. The trouble is that the category was assembled by accident, out of a virus, a wage rise, and a cartoon. Now for the second reason, the one that has nothing to do with feelings. Even if every person in America had stayed perfectly comfortable eating rabbit, it probably still would have lost. Because while rabbit was becoming a pet, chicken was becoming an industry. In the late 1940s, an American competition ran to breed a better meat bird. Prize money, national attention, university breeders, retail backing. It reshaped the bird itself. Within a few decades, growth rates roughly doubled, and the time to market roughly halved. That is not a market preference. That is deliberate industrial engineering. Factory farming chicken did not happen because customers demanded it. It happened because a supply chain was built, and once built, it needed volume. There is also a physical trait working against rabbit that nothing can fix. Rabbits are neotenous. That is the technical term for keeping baby-like features into adulthood. Large eyes set forward in the face, a rounded head, a small nose, soft fur. Humans are hardwired to respond protectively to that combination, because it is the same combination our own infants have. Chickens do not have it. Cows do not have it, though calves come closer. Rabbits have it permanently. So a food taboo built around rabbit has biology quietly reinforcing it from underneath. Every marketing campaign for rabbit meat is arguing against an instinct that fires before the argument is even heard. That is a very difficult product problem, and no chef has solved it yet. Related to that is a finding that comes up repeatedly in this research. People's judgment of how intelligent an animal is shifts depending on whether they are about to eat it. Tell someone an animal is food, and their estimate of its mental life drops. That is the mind protecting the meal. But it only works before the relationship forms. Once a person has held a rabbit or watched their child hold one, that reduction is no longer available to them. The animal has already been filed under someone, not something, and the filing is permanent. This is why the pet boom was so much more destructive to rabbit farming than the virus was. A virus fades in a decade. A category change does not. And that supply chain went vertical. One company owned the breeding stock, the feed mill, the hatchery, the processing plant, and the contracts with the farmers. That structure lets you cut costs at every stage and guarantee identical product year-round. Then advertising budgets arrived. Then fast food arrived and built entire global chains on one bird. Chicken got convenience formats, portion control, and a marketing story about being the healthy choice. Rabbit got none of this. No brand, no advert, no trade body buying billboards, no fast food chain with a rabbit sandwich. In a modern grocery market, an animal without an industry behind it is basically invisible. So the rabbit meat industry in the English-speaking world stayed exactly where it was in 1955. Small, local, and slightly old-fashioned. But there is a physical reason too, and this one is rarely mentioned. Rabbits are genuinely awkward to process at industrial speed. The carcass shape is irregular compared to a broiler, which is close to uniform after decades of breeding for exactly that. Rabbit bones are fine and splinter easily, which is a problem for machinery designed around poultry. Skinning takes more handling than plucking. All of it means more human hands. And human hands are the most expensive part of any meat plant. So even where rabbit farming made biological sense, it failed on the factory floor. The animal that is efficient in the hutch turns out to be inefficient on the line. And that gap between farm efficiency and factory efficiency is where rabbit quietly died. Regulation added the final weight. In the United States, rabbit does not sit under the same mandatory federal meat inspection system as beef, pork, and poultry. Inspection has generally been available on a voluntary, paid basis instead. Read that again from a farmer's point of view. You pay extra for the certification your competitors get automatically. Now try selling into a national supermarket chain with that cost structure, that supply volatility, and no consumer demand to point at. Shelf space in a supermarket is brutally competitive. Every product has to earn its slot in sales per week. Rabbit meat production never had the volume to justify the slot, and without the slot, it never built the volume. That is a loop with no entry point. And it explains something you may have noticed yourself. If you have ever gone looking for rabbit in a normal supermarket, you did not find it missing because it sold out. You found it missing because it was never stocked. And it was never stocked because nobody could prove it would sell. And nobody could prove it would sell because it was never stocked. So now, flip the whole thing around, because the premise of this video has been slightly dishonest, and I want to correct it. It is not true that humans do not eat rabbit. It is true that two countries do not. In France, rabbit is unremarkable. It sits in supermarkets, appears in classic dishes, and nobody blinks. Italy has regional rabbit recipes going back centuries. Spain and Portugal eat it regularly, often with rice or in stews. In Malta, rabbit stew is close to a national dish, and eating it is a social occasion. These are not remote cultures. They are a short flight from London. Same continent, same century, completely different food taboo. Which tells you the wall is not human nature, it is local. And local things can be built, which means they can also be taken apart. Though as you are about to see, that is much harder than anyone expected. And then there is China, which changes the scale entirely. China raises and eats more rabbit than the rest of the world put together. Hundreds of millions of animals a year. In Sichuan, rabbit head is a specific, popular street dish with its own following. Egypt has a long rabbit-eating tradition. So does Mexico, going back well before European contact. Add all of that up, and the picture inverts. Eating rabbit is normal. Refusing to eat rabbit is the local custom, and it belongs to a fairly narrow slice of the map. So the honest version of the question is not why don't humans eat the most efficient meat? It is, why did two specific countries build an emotional wall around one specific animal at the exact moment that animal was proving its worth? People have tried to knock that wall down, and the attempts are genuinely instructive. In the 2000s, chefs in London and New York put rabbit back on menus and rebranded it. Not wartime food, sustainable, ethical, lean, local. Exactly the argument the numbers support. Then, in 2014, a major American natural foods supermarket chain ran a pilot selling rabbit meat. What followed was not indifference. It was organized protest. Demonstrations outside stores, campaigns from rabbit rescue groups, sustained pressure. Within about a year, the chain dropped it. Read that carefully, because it is the whole video in one event. The product was sustainable, humane by the retailer's own standards, and nutritionally excellent. It still lost. And it lost to feelings the market had no way to argue with. Now look at the price, because it produced the strangest outcome of all. Rabbit was the cheap meat, the one you raised when you could not afford beef. Today, in Britain and America, rabbit is usually more expensive per kilo than chicken, and often more expensive than pork. That is a complete inversion in about 70 years. The reason is scale. Small production means high unit costs, patchy supply, and specialist butchers with low turnover. So the food that existed to feed people cheaply now sits on menus as a small plate delicacy at a premium price. The efficiency argument that opened this video is real on the farm and completely absent in the shop. Raising rabbits for meat is cheap. Buying rabbit meat is not. And that gap is entirely manufactured by the market that never got built. And now the twist that almost nobody sees coming. The same thing is starting to happen in the countries that always ate rabbit. French rabbit consumption has been falling for years. Younger generations eat far less of it than their grandparents did. Welfare campaigns against cage systems have grown. Pet rabbit ownership has grown alongside them. It is the identical sequence, arriving 40 years late, which means the English-speaking world was not weird. It was early. Raising rabbits for meat may simply be the first casualty of a much broader shift, where the animals we grow up beside stop being available as food. That is the actual pattern, and rabbit was the test case nobody recognized at the time. So here is the payoff to everything we opened. Rabbit did not lose because it was inefficient. It lost because of timing. It was the most practical protein available at the exact moment three unrelated things collided. A disease that made the animal pitiable in public, a wave of prosperity that turned livestock into pets, and an industry that got built around a bird instead. Rabbit meat never got a fair hearing, because by the time the argument was made, the verdict was already emotional. And that should unsettle you slightly, because none of your own food rules were chosen either. They were inherited from cartoons, shortages, and factory floors you never saw. The efficiency was never the problem. What changed was never the animal. It was us. And the strangest part is that none of it was decided. There was no vote, no policy, no moment where a country agreed that this creature is a companion and that one is dinner. It just settled, quietly, over about 30 years, and then hardened into common sense. If you want to see how deep this goes, watch the video on screen now. It covers the animal we did choose to industrialize, and what that decision actually cost. Because once you notice the line between pet and dinner, you cannot unsee where it was drawn.